Okay, we are going live here. We'll start right at 1 o'clock. So as always, if you're jumping into this after the fact, just fast forward a couple minutes. Give me 1 sec, folks. I'm going to grab a little bit of water. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to finish Matthew today. We're going to finish Matthew starting from chapter 25. I think we'll be able to finish the gospel. So just as an FYI for that, and we'll start promptly at 1 o'clock. I hear the bells and I know it's time to begin. I give people a couple minutes on the front side to join up and settle in if they want to join me live and do this. And we'll talk a little bit about our homework assignment for today too. Yes, homework assignment. You heard me right. Hope everyone had a good 4th of July weekend. I hope you had some fun, ate some good food. My dog is terrified of fireworks, just absolutely terrified of fireworks. So he is not a happy camper on the 4th of July. And of course, people buy up the fireworks and keep firing them off all weekend. So he has not been a happy dog. He likes to hide in the bathroom when the fireworks go off. Sometimes he tries to get in the shower. I think it's probably the safest space from his canine point of view. So okay. The bells are ringing. It is right about time. Welcome, folks, to What Jesus Actually Said, week whatever it is. I don't remember anymore how many weeks we've been doing this. A few now. We are going to finish the Gospel of Matthew today. So I'm going to make that happen. We're starting at chapter 25. We're going to finish the Gospel today. I know it seems like there's a lot to talk about, and there is, but actually the last few chapters don't have a lot of direct quotations from Jesus, so we should be able to move through them relatively quickly. So that's going to be our goal. I'd like to do something too. I mentioned last week, or actually week before last, when I recorded a bonus session for last week, that I wanted to give you a little bit of a homework assignment. Yes, that's a homework assignment, because it's all well and good to listen to this stuff and to read along and do the Bible study. Obviously, that's a good thing. But I think what's even more important is for us to internalize some of what we're actually hearing and learning from this exercise and what we think it's pushing us to do, right? So here's what I'm going to suggest as kind of a little bit of a homework assignment. I'm going to do this too. If you have read through the Gospel of Matthew with me, or if you've read the majority of the Gospel of Matthew, ideally all the words of Jesus in Matthew, you can go back and watch the older videos if you want to catch up on that. I would challenge you to try and summarize what you think are the core themes, the biggest, most important themes and ideas within that gospel. I think that would be interesting. And I want you to use as your source, as your text, only the words of Jesus in Matthew. Okay? And I know that's hard to do because there's all this other stuff. There's all of the epistles, there's other gospels, there's endless, 2,000 years of commentary on the tradition that we are jumping into, that we're reading. But I think it'd be really interesting to try to just limit our gaze, limit it to that piece of it that we've been looking at. And I'm interested in what you think is there. What do you hear as the core themes in the Gospel of Matthew? If you want to send that to me, my email address is on our website, stmatthewschurch.org. It's Dominic at stmatthewschurch.org. Saint is all spelled out. I'm happy to quote you in that, either anonymously or with credit, whichever you prefer. You can tell me what you do. I'm going to assume anonymously, unless you tell me otherwise. Just give a sense of what people are seeing in the gospel, what people are seeing in the text, in the words of Jesus. And I think that'd be a really interesting exercise. I'm going to do that. And I would encourage you to do that. And we'll spend some of our time next week talking about a little wrap up on Matthew before we begin Mark. We're also going to begin Mark next week. So that sounds like fun to you. Do it. If not, then don't. Yeah, whatever you want to do as the Spirit moves, right? So we're Episcopalians. We don't really force people to do anything. So I just suggest that to you, though, as an interesting exercise to help us begin to talk about, to articulate, to understand what we're hearing a little bit more when we look at the words of Jesus, especially when we look at the words of Jesus on their own. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump on into today's portion of Matthew. Like I said, we're going to finish the gospel today. We're starting on chapter 25. And chapter 25 is a lot of teaching of Jesus. We're going to spend the majority of time on chapter 25. And then we're going to move, I think, relatively briefly through the rest of the gospel, because there's not much else spoken by Jesus in the rest of that gospel. So beginning on chapter 25 with the first parable there, verses 1 through 13, the parable of the 10 virgins. And this is a continuation of the teaching from chapter 24, which is about the essentially a long prophecy about the second coming and about the end of time, and about the work of the Messiah. And here we are coming back to it, that same idea with this parable. So 25 at this point is continuing 24. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps but did not take any oil. The wise ones took oil. And then some of them fell asleep, the ones that didn't have oil, right? At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come to meet him." And all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both of us. Instead, go to those who sell oil, buy some." But while they were on the way, the bridegroom arrived, and the ready ones went into the wedding banquet, and the ones that didn't missed out. So this is a parable about preparedness. Right? Watchfulness, preparedness. I'm going to add that word, preparedness. And of course, it's in the context here also of the second coming. Preparedness and watchfulness are the way I've coded this. And you know what this parable is to me? It's a perfect example of that old aphorism that a lack of, a lack of planning on your part does not create a crisis on my part, right? So sometimes folks will not have done the thing that they should have done to prepare, and then they come to you and say, "Oh, well, you have to help me." And of course, it might be very nice and kind and gracious to help them, but sometimes that crisis is of their own making, right? A lack of planning on your part does not create a crisis on my part, and we hear that here with these young women who are waiting to go into the wedding banquet. Half of them were prepared, half of them were not. And so that's the parable that Jesus is telling, and essentially saying that, again, a lack of planning, a lack of work on the part of some folks does not necessitate, in this case, a sort of over-the-top response from the people who did do the planning and were carefully prepared, right? They say, "Hey, I'm here, I'm ready, I have enough. You need to go get the oil that you should have brought anyway," right? Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. We've heard that theme over and over again in Matthew. That's in verse 13. So that's how I've flagged that. I gave the keywords for that one already. Then there's a second parable given beginning in Matthew 14, 25, verse 14. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. This is another very interesting parable. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Interesting. So the gifts are according to their ability. So the landowner thinks that the one who's given the most probably has the greatest ability, right, to manage it. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. He invests it, right? So also the one with 2 gained 2 more, invested that money prudently, carefully, was a good steward of it. But the man who had received one went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid the money. And after a long time, the master returns, he settles accounts. The man who received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5 and gives them, of course. And the master says, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness." The same happens to the other one in verse 22 and in 23. And in 24, then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. "Master," he said, "I know you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you." His master replied, "You wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well, then you should have put my money on deposit with the banker, so that when I return I would have received it with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10. So this is a really interesting parable, and it's a beautiful parable. It's a harsh parable in some ways, right? But it's also a beautiful parable that for me is about that issue of stewardship. Stewardship being not just what we give, right? Not just in the sense of what we've given to God, but also about what we have and how we use the gifts we have. The idea is that God has given all of us various gifts. Maybe those gifts are like this, or the image here is of a financial gift, but I think more often when we think of the gifts that God gives us, we think more of talents or abilities, things we have. And the parable is about using those things properly, using those things in ways that benefits your life and the lives of others, using them for the glory of God, the way that you should be using the gifts that God gives you. Your gifts should not be buried in the ground in the same way that you don't light a lamp and, as Jesus would say, put it under a bushel basket, right? You light a lamp and put it up so that it lightens the room, right? We've heard that parable as well. So in this particular case, it's about using the abilities that we've been given. You have to use them in ways that bring returns to you. You have to do something with them. If you've been given a gift to be an amazing singer, and you never have used that gift, you've never, sung in a choir, you've never lifted up your voice in praise of God, you've never used your voice to brighten someone else's day, then the gift is wasted, right? The gift is not used. Instead, you've sold used cars or something. And that's fine. I mean, it's fine to sell cars if that's what you need to do. But, if you have a beautiful gift of a voice to sing, to use, to make a beautiful music to the Lord, to brighten the lives of others, you should use that gift too. You should use what's given to you. Scripture tells us that to whom much is given, much is expected. So the idea here is that the gifts that we give are not really ours. We are stewards of them. We are stewards on behalf of someone else. In this parable, the ones that they are steward on behalf of is this man going on a journey, right? This sort of landowner, proverbial landowner, literally proverbial landowner in this particular case. But of course, in our case, in the case of the text, the one who gives those gifts is God. So we have a responsibility to give back from what we have received. We have a responsibility to give back to God from it, to give back in ways that matter, to use those gifts, to invest them, not just to enrich our lives, but especially to enrich other people's lives. And I think that's what you see really strongly in this text, right? And instead, notice Jesus says, in the voice of the landowner in verse 28, 29, right? For whoever will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even that will be taken away. But what's the context of that? That sounds really harsh, that, we're going to take it away from someone who has nothing. But the context of that is a situation where someone was not using even the small gift that they were given, right? So the purpose of this is not to say, the rich are going to get richer. That's not Jesus' message. That's not the message of this parable at all. The message of this parable is that of what you have been given, you are responsible for doing something with it, for doing something good with it, for doing something meaningful with it, for using those gifts in ways that help you and help your fellow human being. Okay, so that was that second parable. We were ending that at verse 30. Starting at verse 31, we have yet another story. Actually, this one's sort of more of a prophetic one, starting at verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him. And he will separate one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put one on the right, one on the left, and the king will say to those on the right, "Come, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry." Okay, we all have heard this language before, right? This is very famous. "I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick, you looked after me." And the righteous will answer, "Lord, when did we do any of those things?" And the king will reply, I'm in verse 40, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did also for me." And then we have the obverse of that, beginning at 41. The others say, the others that didn't do that are recognized for not doing that. And so this is a very famous passage of Scripture, a very influential passage of Scripture. Jesus is saying, I think very clearly here, that the way we treat the least of these, and in this case I think you can imagine the marginalized, the poor, the people whom Christ especially loves, the people whom Jesus dedicates his own life of ministry to, as you treated the least of these, you also treated me. Our service towards other people, our love and service towards other people, is how we also serve God. Not that those are always the same thing, but in this particular case, they very much are, right? How we love and serve other people is how we're impacted, or how we are seen as treating God. And so this is a parable. I mean, this is not a parable. It's a story about judgment, right? But the judgment is not happening from us. The judgment is happening from God. The judgment is happening at the end of days. Again, there's so many stories of judgment in Matthew, but none of those stories of judgment in Matthew come from people. Right? People are not judging one another in Matthew. It is God who judges, always, in every case. I think that's interesting to point out. Right? We've seen that over and over again. And this is another example of that that we see very clearly here. The judgment is something that's happening from God, by God. It's God's right to judge, not ours. Important. And here we have an example of anything that these people have done to help the poor, to help the needy. That is also seen as being done to Christ, to God. Okay? So that's a very famous passage at the end of Matthew. And I have a key word of this as being service. I wrote down least of these because I think that's an interesting image. We can think about what that means, the least of these, about generosity and also about judgment. We just spoke about that. So it's really about generosity. What you did for the least of these, you did also for me. It's a very famous quotation from Jesus here. So I think that about covers Matthew 25, and that's the last of Jesus' main teaching in Matthew. It's interesting that that's the point he ends his teaching. I think that's an interesting thing to recognize. This is the last major piece of teaching that Jesus does in this Gospel of Matthew, which is filled with Jesus' teaching, right? So let's move on to chapter 26. So when he finished saying all these things, he said to the disciples, this is the pivot point, the point where it turns, right, for us. "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away. The Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." So that's a prophecy about his own death. I put that in there. So he's anointed at Bethany, and then we get this beautiful scene at Bethany where he's anointed in the home of Simon the leper. We see in verse 6, verse 10. "Why are you bothering this woman?" Jesus says, the woman who had anointed him. "She's done a beautiful thing for me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial." Again, a prophecy of his death. "Truly I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." So, again, this is about service to Jesus. Notice that we've seen two examples of service to Jesus in these two chapters. One at the end of chapter 25, which is about service to other people, that is also service to Jesus. And then here we get sort of the mirror opposite of that. Service to Jesus is also service in a broad sense, right? that by serving Christ, she has fulfilled her duty to him. And that she will be remembered for doing this to the end of the age, right? That quotation, by the way, the poor you will always have with you in verse 11, I think often gets misinterpreted. People see that as a very negative comment, and I think that's so far outside of Jesus' character that you can see that's not what he meant. He's not meaning to say don't serve the poor, especially when he just said to do that, right, at the end of chapter 25. Instead, what you're seeing here is Jesus saying, these issues that you have, these issues of poverty, these issues of marginalized people, these issues of discrimination, right, and economic injustice, these aren't going to go away. These aren't going to magically disappear. They're going to be around as long as human beings are around. You should always work on them. However, in this specific instance, in the instance of the time right before his death, it is appropriate to spend extra time honoring and remembering Christ. So I don't think there's any sort of contradiction there. I think it's about the context of the time in which he was in. He knew he was about to die, and this was the last time that they would be with him. And she is doing this to anoint him because she's doing this out of her own sense of love of God, right? That's ultimately what it is. So continuing on in chapter 26, we get the Last Supper. And so we see in verse 18, they go into the city. They're preparing for Passover. He's going to celebrate the Passover meal with the disciples in his house. That's in verse 18. In verse 20, he tells them that one of them, Judas, is going to betray him. In verse 23, the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. Of course, referring to Judas. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. And then Judas sort of protests this, feeling sort of, the heat is on him. But Jesus refuses to turn away from that statement he just made. Judas says, "You're not talking about me." And he says, "You say that." By the way, that's the same response he says to Pilate, right? Interesting to keep that in mind. In John, I think it is. And then in 26, we get the words, what we call the words of institution, the Last Supper. "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he gives them the cup. "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." So let's just take a pause there for a second. So starting up at verse 18, I had flagged that, yes, this is basically all about the institution of the Last Supper, okay, and the institution of the Eucharist. So we have that in verse 18. That's the beginning of that. There's a little bit of an interchange with Judas in the central part, and then we get the Last Supper itself with the words of institution in verses 26 and on. So just a little point about this. This is a Passover Seder. That's what we would think of it today, a Passover meal, essentially, that he's having with his family, his closest friends and acquaintances, his disciples. And this is the kind of thing that Jewish families would have done together. They would have been doing this all throughout Jerusalem at this same time. They would have been preparing for Passover together and preparing for that. And of course, what happens at Passover is that you have a lamb without blemish, a lamb who is slaughtered for the Passover, becomes the Passover lamb. And that symbology, that imagery, of course, is the imagery that Jesus himself takes on. He is the lamb, right? So the lamb of Passover from ancient times becomes the Lamb of God in the Gospels. And of course, Jesus says, and he actually doesn't say, "Do this in remembrance of me," not here. Okay, that's in one of the other gospel accounts of the Last Supper. But he does say, "Drink this, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." It's interesting because I have a textual note there in this NIV version of the Bible that says that some manuscripts say the new covenant and others don't. So that's interesting. I think we'd have to compare that to some of the other gospel texts to kind of clear that up a little bit more. Ancient texts often have a lot of disagreement about some of those specific words. Okay, so continuing on, that was about Last Supper, body and blood. That's what I put in. And then he has a conversation with Peter. This very night you will all fall away on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. So he's also predicting his resurrection. And Peter says, I'm not going to fall away, right? I'm not going to be that guy. Truly I tell you, Jesus answered, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. This is a very powerful scene that's about to happen. And so Peter is protesting that he's not going to be the one to do that. And of course, Jesus knows that he will and knows what the outcome of that is going to be for him. So then they go out from where they are to a place called Gethsemane, Garden of Gethsemane. It's just outside the old city of Jerusalem, just outside the walls. Sit here while I go over there and pray, in verse 36. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. And then he prays to God, Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken away from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. And again, we've already heard in the Lord's Prayer that is the way that Jesus taught us to pray. Not my will, but thy will be done, right? Thy will be done. So we get a kind of it harkens back to that previous teaching here about prayer. He finds his disciples sleeping. Notice this theme throughout of human weakness, the inability of humans to rise to the occasion. You know, Peter's going to deny him. The disciples are passing out of sleep when he asks them to keep a vigil with him. And they're just, they fall asleep with their posts. Couldn't you keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter. Oh, and Peter's getting the brunt of it here again. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Truer words were never spoken, right? Then he went away a second time. My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. He's sort of coming to terms with what is going to happen. He finds them sleeping again. And by the way, notice this. I think this is kind of a beautiful thing. He doesn't wake them up the second time. He just says, so he left them and went away once more. So Jesus tries to keep the disciples awake with him, but when they are unable to do that, he just continues on. He doesn't, smack them over the head. He doesn't yell at them. He just continues on, being the incredible witness that he is. Human weakness is not something that Jesus is going to worry about, because he's going to take all human failing, all human weakness, all human sin. He's taking that on himself. The third time he comes back in verse 45, are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. So I've tagged a few of those. The things about the disciples I tagged is about being about temptation, spirit and duty. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Spirit and flesh. Should probably add flesh to that to kind of balance it out. And then we hear a little bit that's his arrest. And then they come with swords and clubs. There's a big party of people with the chief priests and the elders send to come arrest him. They're ready for violence. They're ready to, throw down the gauntlet, so to speak. And Judas betrays him with a kiss in that sort of terribly poetic way. In verse 50, he says, do what you came for, friend. And so the men arrest him, and one of the disciples kind of jumps the gun and takes a swing with a sword at one of these people that's come to arrest Jesus, cuts off an ear, and Jesus says, put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Another famous proverb from Jesus. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way? Am I leading a rebellion that you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me, but this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. So he's sort of mocking the Pharisees even at the end here. We've had all these back and forth with the Pharisees, and he's continuing that here. I mean, he's saying, like, I was in the temple every day. You could have arrested me anytime you wanted to. I was always there. You could have found me. Instead, you had to send this whole SWAT team to come pick me up, right? As if you were arresting some dangerous bandit leader, when you know that's not the case. And then the disciples deserted him and fled. They deserted him and fled. It's powerful. And the image, I think, is very powerful. He's asking them to stay with him. He's asking them to be faithful to him. And they can't. They just can't. They go to sleep. They run away. They flee. Especially when the soldiers come out, they're done. They're out of the picture. And Jesus has such grace and mercy on them. And thanks be to God, because of course we're just like that. I mean, if you don't see yourself in the disciples, you need to take a second look at your life, because we're all like that, right? We're all unable to keep the commandments that Christ calls us to. We're unable to bring our lives to that level. We're unable to do what we're called to do, and yet we know that God is faithful to us anyway. That's why it's a covenant. That's why it's a covenant, because it doesn't matter. Even if we don't keep our part of the bargain, God always keeps God's part of the bargain. God always offers us reconciliation and mercy and love, even when we don't deserve it, especially when we don't deserve it. And there's a beautiful example, a tragic example of that here in Matthew 26. So moving on just a little more, in verse 64 here, he is being interviewed by the high priest, and Jesus says, the high priest is accusing him of having said he's the Son of the living God, the Messiah. So again, to understand the issue here, what essentially Jesus is being tried for is blasphemy, because, and it's true, let's be clear about that. What he says is blasphemous if anyone else had said it, right? Jesus is making a claim that is a blasphemous claim. He's making the claim that he is the Son of God. And what you need to realize, what I think we have to kind of come to terms with, is that from a perspective of the first century and the people living at that time, of course that was blasphemy. Of course, like, God is the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, according to the prophet Isaiah. God is someone you cannot look upon and live, according to Moses. How on earth God is walking around, hanging out with people, eating Passover meals with them, is just beyond comprehension. It's still beyond comprehension. It's crazy. It's crazy. From our human perspective, it's crazy. But of course, it's God's perspective and God's plan that makes it so much more than that. So he's being charged with blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God. Okay? And I think, we can all understand why that would be. So he's under oath, he's like sworn in the courtroom. He's under oath. The high priest is saying, "You have said you're a son of God," and that's blasphemy. And Jesus says, "You have said so." This is in verse 64. "But I say to you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." So it's both a declaration of who he is and also a prophecy about the second coming. And then the high priest says, "Look at that. There we go. He's speaking blasphemy. He needs to be condemned to death." And they go along with that. So Peter, meanwhile, is outside. And so I tag that as Son of Man and Second Coming, just so you know. And then Peter is meanwhile sitting outside, and he has this conversation with this servant girl who works there. She says, "Aren't you one of those guys that used to hang out with that Jesus person?" And of course, he ends up denying it 3 times. And then we have in verse 75 a repeat quotation of Jesus: "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." Peter remembers that thing that he had previously heard. And of course, it says he went outside and wept bitterly. And he remembers how Jesus predicted that, no, you're going to be one of the ones who is denying me very strongly, Peter, even though you think you won't. again, it's just such a tragic story, but it's so beautiful and to me very hopeful because these people are such failures at following him, at being his disciples. And of course, we also are failures at that, right? And I think if we accept that and realize it's not about us, but about God's grace, it was never about us, but about what we can accomplish through the grace of God, we can go a lot further than if we think we're going to do anything because somehow we're equipped for it, because we're not. It's God who's equipped, and God in whom we live and move and have our being, God in whom we're able to overcome those obstacles, but it's not because we are special, right? Okay, that's the end, and then in verse 75, I just tagged that as denial again, because it's a reiteration of the previous chapter in verse 34. It's a direct quote, call back to that. So in chapter 27, Judas hangs himself. Jesus goes before Pilate. Now remember, keep in mind, just a little sidebar here, that the Jewish authorities, the religious authorities, are not the final word here in first century Judea. It is a Roman province, so the Roman secular authorities are the final word, and the religious authorities cannot put anyone to death. So even at this time in history, the Romans have the control over that sort of thing. And so they have to basically just make a recommendation to Pilate, who's the local governor, Pontius Pilate. So Jesus goes to Pilate, the governor of Judea, and Pilate says, "Are you calling yourself the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "You said so." And he refuses to answer any other questions. He refuses to say anything else. And Pilate is kind of mystified by all this. Pilate is not treated as sympathetically or as fully a character here as he is, especially in John. There's a much more fully fledged kind of character of Pilate. But Pilate here still is a little bit mystified by the whole situation. He's really not. He sees it as kind of an internal religious dispute. Doesn't understand why they care so much about having this man killed. So he sees if the people want to release him, because they would release a prisoner, and instead they want to release this murderer, this serial killer, Barabbas instead, because they'd rather see Jesus crucified. So that's the scene that plays out, and you all know that well from Good Friday services, from Palm Sunday services. And Pilate is played a little bit sympathetically. This isn't a word of Jesus, but I'll just point out to you in verse 24. He sees the crowd getting upset and sort of more and more worked up by him because he's so mystified about what's the big deal with Jesus. So he washes his hands of it, like literally washes his hands of it, and says, "You fine, it's your responsibility. You made the decision." Again, Pilate is kind of an interesting character, caught between a rock and a hard place in some ways. So then we have the rest of the Passion. And there's no more words of Jesus until verse 46. In verse 46, we get a little bit of Aramaic. Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's a direct quotation from Psalm 22. So right at the end, Jesus still quoting the Psalms. We've seen a lot of the prophets, a lot of the Psalms being quoted by Jesus, and then finally, right at the end, it's the Psalms that are on his lips. And it's a profound sense of loss, of desperation, of feeling like God is not in your life and is not doing anything for you. And it's such a powerful thing coming from him, who is the Son of God. And yet in this moment, in this exact moment, we understand theologically Jesus is taking on all of the sin of the world, taking that on, the bad things that were done before him, the bad things that you and I are doing now, taking that on to his heart and spirit, and then giving them up, losing his life for them so that we can be free of them. That's what's happening here. He is atoning for all the sins of the world, and for this moment, he is feeling that absence from God. So that's right before he died. And some of the soldiers think he's calling for Elijah because they misunderstand that he's quoting from the Psalms. And then finally he's died, he's buried. And then in 28, Sorry, I keep moving on a little bit too quickly. I flagged that last portion there as being, I wrote the word forsaken, and it's a prayer. It's a desperate final prayer, a painful, powerful prayer. And I think it's interesting that Jesus quotes the Psalms here too. You know, he could have said anything, but he uses the Psalms. And that's just once again one of those things for me, that we have that great liturgical tradition. We have the Book of Common Prayer, we have the Psalms, we have the Scriptures. We can use those things to help us pray, to give us the words to say in times when there are no other words. You know, the Psalms, I'm going to tell you right now, are not always happy. They're not always happy, especially with God. They sometimes say very difficult things, very profound things, very hard things. There's plenty of that in the Psalms. And so it gives us a way to say those hard things too, to let our spirits say those things, to mourn and cry and grieve and get angry, and all the things that we need to be frustrated. One of my favorite Psalms is a psalm about frustration. It's Psalm 73. I love it. Look it up sometime. And so we see Jesus doing that again and using that as the baseline for his own way of speaking to God. And then finally, we're going to conclude here with chapter 28. And once again, there's not a whole lot to say here. He is seen again. Let me just make sure I understand the context here really quickly. So basically, there's an angel that speaks to the women who come out to the tomb. And Jesus met them. He meets his disciples here. They see him again. Greetings, he says in verse 9. And then, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and then they will see me. So he's going to meet up with them in Galilee, as he said he would. Right? In his hometown, in the area where he spent his life preaching. He's going to meet them there. And so there's a little bit of an interchange with the guards and with the elders, and they're wondering what happened to the body. And then he meets up with the 11 disciples, minus Judas, of course, who committed suicide, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. Maybe the Mount of the Beatitudes, perhaps. I'm not sure if we're told specifically what place that was in Galilee, but one of those mountains in Galilee, probably the Mount of the Beatitudes, or the place where the feeding of the 5,000 happened, probably one of those two areas. Both of them are kind of on hills next to the Sea of Galilee. And he gives the disciples a commission, what we call the Great Commission. This is the last words that he says to them in Matthew. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. So there we go. We get the final command of Jesus. Go and make disciples of all nations. Not just Jewish people in Judea, not just Greek people, not just people who look like you, but all nations everywhere can participate, can be part of this equally, can share in the grace and blessings of God equally, right? And that commission inspired them. And you know the amazing thing about this? Of those 11 disciples that were with him on that day, 10 of them became martyrs for their faith. 10 of them. So, and in fact, I believe the 12th disciple that was added as well afterwards also becomes a martyr. So 11 of the 12 disciples in the Acts of the Apostles era, right, were martyred for their faith. They died for their Christian faith. They went to places like Peter did, to Rome, was preaching in Rome, right in the heart of the empire, the imperial power, and they were martyred there. They were killed for teaching the Christian faith, for spreading the gospel, for spreading the good news. The only one who dies of old age is John. John ends up in exile. He ends up in exile on a little island called Patmos, which is off the coast of modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and he ends up dying of old age there after his many prophetic revelations. But all the rest of them end up being martyrs for their faith. And I just want to point that out because I think that's a really powerful thing to consider, to think about for us. You know, Jesus was only with them for 2 years. Have you ever met somebody for 2 years knew them for 2 years. I mean, it's not even very long, and you were so profoundly moved, so changed by what happened to you, so absolutely converted in heart, mind, and soul that you would die for that person. I mean, that's remarkable, isn't it? It's truly incredible. So I think it's an interesting thing to think about, to consider the impact that he had on the people who knew him. There's really no reason that we should remember Jesus at all from any outside circumstances. There's no reason that we should even be talking about this. He's a Jewish peasant. He didn't even speak Greek as far as anybody can tell. He didn't speak the language of the day. There's no reason why Jesus of Nazareth should be remembered by history. And yet he changes the entire course of history. Why? Because he wasn't just a Jewish peasant. He was that, but he was also the Son of God. And I think that's what the message of this gospel, ultimately that's what it's about, of course. So that's where we're going to end Matthew. We have a few more minutes. I just want to say thank you for those of you who joined in. I plan on continuing this. I'd like to do all 4 Gospels. And so I'm going to jump in with Mark next week. But before we jump in with Mark next week, again, I'd love, if you are interested in trying to do this, I'd love to hear kind of a short summary, emphasis on short summary. Think paragraph at most, just giving the core ideas, the themes, the issues that you think Jesus gives the most emphasis to, that are the biggest themes and ideas and teachings in Matthew. I'm really curious to know what you think. If you had to say, just from Jesus' own words, and you can't say something like Jesus is the Son of God. Like, yes, that is the overall purpose of the Gospels, is to proclaim that truth. That is what the word gospel means, right? That good news. The Messiah has come. We have a new covenant. Yeah. Okay. We know theologically, but I'm talking about the teaching portion of Jesus, because that's the emphasis of this exercise. What is Jesus saying? Right? That's the name of this series, what Jesus actually said. What is Jesus saying to people in his own words that you think are the main themes, the biggest elements that you see in Matthew? I'm going to make some notes too. I'll tell you what I think, but I'd love to hear your ideas about what you think before I do that. And so I'm not going to say anything right now, because I don't want to change your reaction, or have you repeat back to me the things that I'm saying. I want you to come to this with some fresh eyes and say, yes, this is what I see in the text. So if you're interested in doing that, send me just a short email this week sometime, and by Monday, let's say, of next week, and let me know, and I'll include it. And you can let me know whether or not you want me to say your name. I'm going to assume you don't want me to, unless you say that it's okay. And I'll have some quotes from that just to see what other people say. I'll tell you what I think about it, and we'll have some kind of bullet point summary of Matthew, that Jesus is teaching in Matthew. Again, I think that's the key thing we need to kind of underline. We're talking about just his teaching, just his words in Matthew. And then we'll also get a start on the Gospel of Mark. And we'll just do this in the order there in the Bible. I know Mark is written before Matthew, and we could have done this chronologically, but we're just going to keep it simple. So we're going to jump into Mark. Mark's also the shortest gospel, so that should only take us maybe, 4 to 6 weeks, something like that, if we do this once a week. And we'll get through Mark as well, and then we'll have half of that done. And I think it'll be really interesting at the end of this to be able to say, these are the core themes in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. We have sort of core themes. What are the overall core themes that we're seeing? What is Jesus saying the most of? And I think when we get done with it, again, what does Jesus not say? That's an interesting way to take a look at this too, is to say, what are those things that you kind of are surprised that are not part of Jesus' teaching? And that can take us to some interesting places as well. Thank you all for joining on this little journey. And again, I'd love to hear your comments, love to hear your feedback, love to hear what you think you're hearing in the Gospels. I hope that Scripture for you is something that feeds your life, fills your life with meaning and purpose. It always has for me. And it's something that you can come back to and reflect on, and you learn from, and helps you grow spiritually day in and day out, and gives you a sense of how beautiful and wonderful this world is, and that God made it, and God made you, and God has a purpose for you and for the world, and you can trust and have faith in that. because Jesus is the example of that, the Word made flesh, here to teach us. Thanks, and I'll see you next week.